How's it going, everybody? This is Aaron the Pedantic, and let me get the first thing out of the way. Yes, I shaved. It's a work condition, so it's not going to go away for a while. I'm going to have to this is actually too long right now, unfortunately. So sorry. All right, so that's out of the way. We don't have to ever talk about it again. We can just move past it. So the topic of today's discussion is actually inspired, sort of in a way, by one of my friend RPG Pundit's videos where he was talking about a particular group of people that are absolute AD&D first edition purists that think that you should play exactly how it's written. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit because I run into them fairly commonly in various social media situations, and I have things to say. So, who are they? Well, they are called the BROSR, or at least that's what a lot of people refer to them as. It's really, I don't know that it's exactly even fair for them to call themselves that, or for us to call them that, because whenever you think about what is the old school, the OSR, there are people that'll say it's old school revival, and what was that? That was the bringing back of the old rules and stuff like that. And you have various iterations of retro clones and stuff like that. I don't know that that's really even a fair thing to call them, because of the fact that most of the people that I have talked to that are in those circles, not all, but most, are people that they're just still playing AD&D first edition. They didn't really stop, or if they did, then they didn't, move on and then go back or anything like that. This was just, they've just been playing it, and that's what they do. They just like AD&D, and that's what they stick to. So is it really a revival? It's a continuation more than anything else. Now, the first time that I encountered them was a really funny and interesting post by a guy. I don't know if I want to say names. I may say names later or in the comments or something like that. But basically, it was a really funny thread with and here's the thing that's really sad, is that a lot of times these things have nuggets of truth in them and some wisdom in them and various times. But it was about being an elite level player. And it was a funny meme because it was talking like it was using Olympian pictures and stuff like that with weightlifting and all that kind of stuff in order to kind of get across the message that, this was the maximum machismo kind of thing. And it was really amusing. And there was some interesting stuff about basically being a player that kind of directs the party and, keeps the momentum going in order to accomplish their objectives and stuff like that. And it was an interesting thread. And then, once you kind of go down that rabbit hole, you start meeting some people in these circles and stuff like that. And, just like with any community, if you're just listening, I'm using air quotes, you're going to encounter people that are more extreme and less extreme, and people that are more reasonable and less reasonable, people that are assholes and people that are willing to have like good faith discussions and stuff like that. I'm not going to name names because some of them, it just depends on what day you catch them, and there are various types. So I'm not going to peg anybody down with any of that shit. You can just sort that out yourself. But the crux of their message is that they play true AD&D. That is their whole thing. I'm not going to throw out the big G word. Y'all know what I'm talking about. The one that has honestly been polluted in a lot of ways, because everybody just wants to talk about how, you're just trying to gatekeep me and all this kind of stuff. Whenever you throw these things around so much, there just gets a point where it's just like, it doesn't even sound like compelling anymore. And a lot of times it's not even an accurate representation of what's happening. I'll just say that sometimes they can be douchey, and we'll just move on. So what is the true AD&D? With the air quotes. Basically, what they will posit is that if you run AD&D first edition specifically, exactly as Gary wrote it, then you will get true AD&D. Now, there is a lot of stuff there, a lot of stuff to unpack because it's written in High Gygaxian. And the thing about Gary is that he said stuff sometimes out of both sides of his mouth. And, people can read the same thing and then they can get different interpretations, and then you're going to end up with different stuff. But if you use the mechanics as he wrote them and all that, those kinds of things, you're going to run into true AD&D is the thing that they suggest. My biggest issue with this is that almost everybody I've ever talked to who played AD&D back in the day has said, well, no, we didn't use absolutely everything in there because some of that stuff just didn't look appealing, or, various things like that. A lot of people said, I don't like training rules. We didn't use training rules. Some of them will say, maybe we tried this one thing once, we didn't like it, we threw it away. There are very few people, actually, I really can't think of anybody that just said out the gate, yeah, I always ran it with exactly all of the mechanics as written, and I never deviated. Or, I never felt like it wasn't good for the game that I wanted to run. Or, everybody seemed to go off of that railroad. Railroad was the wrong word to use. People are going to get different, went off of that camp, I guess, away from that specific set of rules. Now, as I said, one of the things to consider is that Gary has said a lot of stuff. And now this is both just directly in the first edition DMG and subsequently. So if we're trying to appeal to the true AD&D from the perspective of this is exactly how Gary played his game kind of thing, really, we can't exactly take that for granted that is the truth. Now, not all of them are trying to posit that. There are some of them that say Gary was wrong about this thing or that thing, whenever he ended up going back and saying that he was wrong to put stuff in. So to be more specific, let's take a look at the grappling rules I say take a look. I'm not going to show you because they're freaking complex and all this kind of stuff. And that would take too long. But if you look at the grappling rules in first edition AD&D, there's a lot to them. It's a bit of a complex resolution mechanic, and most people threw it out. And what you can find is that there are statements from Gary where he said that what he would do in grappling situations whenever they need to try and figure out what would happen is he said sometimes he would use the strategic review rules. So not the AD&D rules, the strategic review rules. And that a lot of times he would just use common sense and then just roll a die, perhaps. So he didn't really use the first edition grappling rules. In fact, he said that it was an error for him to put them in there. The reason that he said that he put it in there to begin with is because of the fact that he was adding more complexity for people that said that they craved more complexity. That's a lot to think about, isn't it? Because then you start looking at things and you're like, okay, now how much of this is just because of the fact that he wanted to add more complexity because people wanted more complexity? How much of it did he actually intend to use? Whenever you look at his house rules that he was using towards the later end of his life, God rest his soul, all that kind of stuff, then basically what you're looking at is he's using the 3 little brown books. He's using a bunch of house rules, and that's it. Now, that doesn't mean that that's how he played it whenever he was writing AD&D. Not at all. Whenever you look at how much you should adhere to the rules, and this is one of the things that Gary tended to do a lot, was he'll say things kind of on both ends. For instance, if you look at the afterword to the first edition AD&D, you'll see that basically he says, never be beholden to, the rules or some barracks room lawyer, that blah, 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 rules lawyer. And it emphasizes at the very beginning of it, the spirit of the game. And we'll go back to that. But which the spirit of the game is very important, but if you look in I think it's in the preface, or it could be, it's in the beginning of the book. One of the things that he said is that the rules he has come up with are things that have arisen out of experience, which I completely believe. And these are things that he has played with and tested and all these kinds of things, and they work well, and they will produce a certain type of game. I believe that this is true. Maybe not that everything was 100% tested or whatever, but that most of this shit arose out of experience. I 100% believe that. And part of the reason that I believe that is because whenever I played BX, whenever I ran BX, when I ran into an issue, look, AD&D has a solution for it just about almost every time. Gary will say, this is what the players do. This is how they abuse this thing. And this is what I did. And wouldn't you know it, it seems to be the case that every single time it seemed to be just about accurate. So I believe it. You also have to look at the fact that Gary was trying to do multiple things with his writings at different points. There are points when he's trying to sell stuff, and those are very apparent, where he says only use official TSR products whenever you're buying your miniatures, because those are the only ones that are, of the best integrity of your game, for the integrity of your game kind of thing. Your little plastic minis, they're so important, guys. You just don't even know it. And then there are other times when it's just like, he's writing things where it's a lot, not quite in that direction. A lot of the subsequent writings after the fact, which to me would sound like the things you would say after you're done making your money off of things, you're a little bit more honest. Then you have those statements about, the things that we don't want them to know is that they don't really need us. When it comes to making rules and all those kinds of things, they don't really need us. They don't really need our books. All that kind of stuff. So where do I land on what the true AD&D is, and should you care, and all that kind of stuff? Well, to me, the true AD&D, and you can take this with a grain of salt because I'm not an AD&D scholar. I've played it, I've read it, but I am not somebody who's been embroiled in it for decades and, just like endlessly pored over the tomes and, thought deeply about what they meant, read everything that was written from OD&D Beyond and, all the forum entries on Dragon's Foot that Gary wrote and all this kind of stuff. I'm not that guy. This is just an opinion. But one of the nuggets of truth that you will get from these people is that if you use the rules in conjunction and you try and do an honest attempt at doing that, you will get a certain type of campaign play. And this certain type of campaign play could be something that you will enjoy, that you'll get stuff out of. There have been, as I said, a lot of things that I have pulled from AD&D because they produce certain results, and that those results are better for the kind of game that I want to run than other things. So it stands to reason that if you use all of these things in conjunction, you will end up with a certain type of game. This is going to be a type of game where you have very long campaigns because of the fact that you're having, when I say long, I mean in duration of, real, like game world time, real world time, all that kind of stuff, because of the fact that you have proper timekeeping and things like that. That is one of the things that is very important to what I would say is the spirit of the game that's being presented with AD&D specifically. So, you have him suggesting that with each day that passes in real life, you pass a day in the calendar of the game. 1 for 1 is what it's called. That will do certain things. Training rules. A lot of people threw training rules out. Well, here's the thing. If you're having to use training rules, then you have, number one, you have a way for them to spend money that will be, put a counterbalance on, all of the gold that they get that otherwise might just sit around. And you have also a way to make time pass for those characters. Well, at that point, maybe you want to bring in other PCs and do stuff like that. You also need time for your magical research and things like that to occur. Speaking of magical research and learning spells and stuff like that, the percentage in order to see if you learn a spell or not. Basically what this will do is this prevents a situation where everybody knows basically about the same kinds of spells. Well, I mean, just the fact that you pretty much have to learn them from scrolls for the most part. That is another thing that produces a different kind of game, because that is not the case with newer D&D. With newer D&D, it's just like, well, I leveled up, I'm going to choose these spells and I'm happy. And really almost everybody ends up choosing roughly about the same spells because they're the best spells. You end up with almost the same kinds of magic casters every time and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm trying to say is that there are nuggets of wisdom that you can find in these people. And that if you do these things, if you run AD&D raw, then you will end up with a certain type of game, probably, if you implement it correctly. And that could be a certain expression of D&D. It could be called the true AD&D. Sure, we can call it that. My biggest problem with these people is that their heads are so far up their asses about it. That's really the biggest thing. People that don't want to use these things, fine. Really, to me, the worst advertising that old school play has is people going around and telling people how they have to play their games or else they are inferior. That's the biggest problem I have with all of this. And unfortunately, there are a lot of douchebags in those circles, and that's exactly how they talk. And unfortunately, lately, my interactions with them, it tends to be that they are barraging somebody for having an opinion that is somehow counter to something that they hold, and then they lose their shit and they act like total assholes. That is what has tended to happen a lot of the times. And whenever it happens is somebody who's already a grognard and they enjoy the old school play and stuff like that, then it's like, okay, they're jerks, whatever. Those people, those grognards, they understand that that is not a good representation of how most of us that enjoy old school play are like. When I say, that includes obviously people like me that are newcomers that enjoy this kind of stuff, and people that have been around for a long time. But there are some people that this may be their first and only exposure to what they would call the OSR. And of course, I've already said these people are not really OSR, in my opinion. And from that point on, then they go on and they continue spreading the OSR as toxic BS and all that kind of stuff, where perhaps there are people that may be interested in taking a look at old school play, and then they see that crap and then they say, I'd rather not. And that's a loss. And I don't want that to happen. So, if I could ask anything of anybody, number one, it could be maybe you want to try, like, look at the 1E stuff and think about running particular things with those mechanics that you skipped on before because you thought you didn't like them, or because maybe you just never really wanted to try AD&D and you're just a BX person, or you're just an OD&D person. Maybe you want to try some of these things. Maybe you want to try a game of second edition or first edition or Osric or something like that. Maybe you want to do that. Give it a shot. The other thing that I would ask is don't be a douche. Especially whenever you're representing old school play. And I hate to phrase it like that, but for some reason, people just, they tend to see this stuff and it sticks, and it's hard to undo that kind of thing. Whenever I started playing Dungeon World, there were people that came up to me and they said, man, the game's not that bad, but there are so many people in those circles that are just, they're smelling their own farts so hard and all that kind of stuff. It seems to be something that's just endemic with any kind of serious gaming community, where people just, they smell their own farts and they take themselves too seriously. They think they're superior, and it doesn't do anybody any favors. So if you're doing it, please stop. If you know somebody who's doing it, tell them to cut that shit out. Do what you want. I'm not your boss. You're in charge of yourself. I'm just a guy who says stuff on the internet, and sometimes people listen. That's all I have for this video. I have been kind of quiet lately because I've had a lot of stuff going on, and honestly, I've been doing a lot of gaming and watching a lot of Rick and Morty. I've just kind of like been laying low for a bit, and I wanted to make sure that whenever I made another video, I had something to say that wasn't just me making a video. I don't want to ever do that. I don't want to just make a video because I need to make a video. I want to make a video because I have something to say. So that's it for this video. May have a stream later sometime this weekend, and probably going to do an update on just how my games have been going. I know that most people don't care, but some people do. So we'll do that. Take it easy. Take care of yourself.